The ocean was a vast, unyielding expanse of darkness, a place where light dared not venture. It was a world of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the submarine's hull as it descended deeper into the abyss. The Abyssal Voyager was state-of-the-art, a marvel of engineering designed to explore the uncharted depths of the Mariana Trench. But for Dr. Evelyn Carter, the lead marine biologist on board, the mission felt less like a scientific endeavor and more like a descent into madness. The crew of 6 had been underwater for 3 days, and the pressure outside was mounting with every foot they sank. The sub's interior was cramped, the air thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and sweat. Evelyn sat hunched over her console, her eyes fixed on the sonar screen. The blip had appeared an hour ago, a massive, irregular shape moving just outside the sub's range of visibility. It was too large to be a whale, too deliberate in its movements to be a natural formation. "You seeing this, Ev?" Captain Mark Harris leaned over her shoulder, his voice low and tense. His face was pale under the dim glow of the control panel, his usual bravado replaced by unease. "I see it," Evelyn replied, her fingers tightening around the edge of the console. "It's following us." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The sub's lights barely pierced the inky blackness outside, revealing only fleeting glimpses of the alien landscape, jagged rock formations, swirling clouds of sediment, and the occasional bioluminescent creature darting past the viewport. But the thing on the sonar was different. It was massive, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it were stalking them. "Maybe it's just a school of fish," suggested Liam, the youngest member of the crew. His voice wavered, betraying his attempt at optimism. Evelyn shook her head. "Fish don't move like that. This thing, it's intelligent. It's watching us." The sub shuddered violently, throwing everyone off balance. Alarms blared as the pressure gauge spiked, the needle trembling dangerously close to the red zone. Evelyn grabbed the console to steady herself, her heart pounding in her chest. "What the hell was that?" Mark barked, his hands flying over the controls. "Something hit us," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared at the sonar screen, her blood running cold. The blip was gone. The crew fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the sub's engines. Then a low, resonant thud echoed through the hull like the beat of a monstrous heart. It was coming from below. "We need to get out of here," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Now." Mark nodded, his face grim. "Prepare for ascent. Full power to the thrusters." The sub groaned in protest as the engines roared to life, the hull creaking under the strain. Evelyn clutched her seat, her knuckles white, as the sub began to rise. But the thudding didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was determined to keep them from escaping. Then the lights flickered. "No, no, no," Mark muttered, frantically flipping switches. "Power's draining. Something's sucking the energy from the systems." Evelyn's stomach dropped as the sub's interior plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency panels. The thudding grew louder, closer, until it felt like the sound was inside the sub with them. She could feel it in her bones, a primal vibration that made her want to scream. "What is that?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling with fear. No one answered. They didn't need to. The truth was written on their faces in the way their eyes darted to the viewport, searching the darkness for something they couldn't see but knew was there. The sub lurched violently, throwing Evelyn to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The viewport was filled with movement, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then she saw it. A massive, unblinking eye pressed against the glass, its pupil dilated to absorb every shred of light. It was impossibly large, its surface slick and glistening like wet obsidian. Evelyn froze, her mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of the creature. The eye shifted, revealing a glimpse of something even more horrifying, a gaping maw lined with rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "Oh God," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "It's not just watching us, it's hunting us." The sub shuddered again, the hull groaning under the strain. Evelyn could hear the sound of metal bending, of seals breaking as the pressure outside threatened to crush them. The creature's eye disappeared, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness as it began to circle the sub, its movements slow and deliberate. "We're not going to make it," Liam said, his voice hollow. "We're going to die down here." Evelyn's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way out, but there was none. They were trapped. thousands of feet below the surface, at the mercy of a creature that defied comprehension. The thudding grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the sub would shake apart. And then, silence. The crew held their breath, the absence of sound somehow more terrifying than the noise. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the viewport, waiting for the creature to reappear. But the darkness outside was still, the water unnaturally calm. "Is it?" Liam asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the sub was rocked by a violent impact, the force of it sending them tumbling to the floor. Evelyn's head slammed against the console, stars exploding in her vision. She struggled to stay conscious, her ears ringing as the sub spun out of control. The last thing she saw before the lights went out was the viewport. The glass cracking under the pressure as the creature's massive form loomed in the darkness, its maw opening wide to swallow them whole. When Evelyn woke, she was alone. The sub was silent, the air thick with the smell of salt and decay. The viewport was shattered, water pooling on the floor as the ocean began to seep inside. She stumbled to her feet, her head throbbing, and looked around. The others were gone, their seats empty, their consoles dark. "Mark?" she called, her voice echoing in the empty sub. "Liam?" There was no answer, only the sound of water dripping, of metal creaking as the sub began to collapse in on itself. Evelyn's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she realized the truth. They had never stood a chance. She turned to the shattered viewport, her heart pounding as she peered into the darkness. The creature was gone, but she could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on her chest, a whisper in the back of her mind. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and it would never let her go.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The cabin stood alone in the clearing, its wooden walls weathered and warped by years of neglect. For Claire, it had been a refuge, a place to escape the chaos of the city and the memories that haunted her. But now, as she stood on the creaking porch, staring into the dense forest, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The first night had been uneventful. She'd unpacked her few belongings, started a fire in the stone hearth, and fallen asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees. But on the second night, she heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world. A sound that made her blood run cold. Claire had tried to convince herself it was just an animal, a bear or a wolf prowling the woods. But deep down, she knew better. The growl was too deliberate, too intelligent. It was as if whatever was out there was testing her, probing the edges of her sanity. By the third night, the growling had stopped, replaced by something far worse. Whispers. They came in the dead of night, soft and insidious, slipping through the cracks in the cabin walls like smoke. At first, she couldn't make out the words. They were fragmented, disjointed, as if spoken in a language she wasn't meant to understand. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. Claire. Her name. They were saying her name. She tried to ignore them, burying herself under blankets and pressing her hands over her ears. But the whispers were relentless, worming their way into her mind until she could think of nothing else. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind sent her heart racing. She began to see things out of the corner of her eye, shadows moving where there should be none, shapes flitting between the trees. On the fifth night, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, determined to confront whatever was tormenting her. The forest was eerily silent, the usual chorus of crickets and owls absent. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled trunks of the pines and the thick underbrush. She scanned the trees, her breath visible in the cold air, but there was nothing there. And then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. It was coming from inside the cabin. Claire's stomach dropped. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The cabin's windows were dark, the fire long since extinguished. But as she approached the door, she saw it. A figure standing in the window, its face pressed against the glass. It was pale and gaunt, its eyes sunken and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She screamed, dropping the flashlight as she stumbled back. The figure didn't move, its unblinking eyes fixed on her, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat huddled in a corner of the cabin, clutching a kitchen knife, her eyes darting to every shadow. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. They were no longer just saying her name. They were telling her things she didn't want to hear, things she couldn't understand. You shouldn't have come here. It's too late. It's already inside. By morning, she was a wreck. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her eyes bloodshot and hollow. She knew she had to leave, to get as far away from the cabin as possible. But as she packed her things, she noticed something strange, a faint, acrid smell, like burning hair. It was coming from the basement. The cabin didn't have a basement. Claire stared at the trapdoor in the floor, her heart pounding. She had never noticed it before, hidden beneath a worn rug. The wood was warped and splintered, the iron handle rusted with age. She told herself not to open it, to just leave and never look back. But something compelled her, a morbid curiosity she couldn't ignore. She grabbed the handle and pulled, the hinges screeching in protest. The smell grew stronger, almost overwhelming, as a rush of cold air wafted up from the darkness below. Her flashlight flickered as she pointed it down the narrow staircase, revealing rough stone walls, slick with moisture. The steps were uneven, worn smooth by years of use. Claire hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the whispers were louder now, echoing up from the depths, urging her forward. She took a deep breath and descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was larger than she expected, the walls lined with strange symbols carved into the stone. They seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if alive. And then she saw it. In the center of the room was a massive circular pit, its edges lined with jagged stones. The air above it shimmered like heat rising from asphalt, and the whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a language she couldn't understand. Claire's legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, her mind unraveling as she stared into the abyss. Something was moving in the pit, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It pulsed and writhed, tendrils of shadow reaching out like grasping hands. And then she saw the faces, dozens of them, twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. They were trapped, their souls bound to the pit, their suffering eternal. Claire tried to look away, but she couldn't. The darkness had her now, its tendrils wrapping around her mind, pulling her closer. She felt herself slipping, her thoughts fragmenting as the whispers consumed her. And then, just as she was about to fall into the pit, she heard a voice. A single, clear voice amidst the chaos. Run. She didn't know where the strength came from, but she obeyed. She scrambled to her feet and bolted up the stairs, the whispers screaming in her ears. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cold air burning her lungs. She didn't look back as she ran through the forest, branches tearing at her skin, her mind a whirlwind of terror. When she finally reached the road, she collapsed, her body trembling with exhaustion. She didn't know how long she lay there, but when she finally looked up, the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the trees. The cabin was gone, swallowed by the forest as if it had never existed, but Claire knew it was still there, waiting, and she knew the whispers would never stop.
Story number 3.
The town of Black Hollow was a forgotten place, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Its streets were lined with crumbling buildings, their windows dark and lifeless. The few residents who remained spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the dense forest that surrounded the town. They called it the Hollow for a reason. It was a place where things went to die. For Sarah, it was a fresh start. She'd inherited her grandmother's old house on the edge of town, a sprawling Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging roof. It was a far cry from the bustling city life she'd left behind, but she didn't mind. The quiet was a welcome change, or so she thought. The first night in the house was uneventful. She'd spent the day unpacking, her footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floors. The house was filled with relics of her grandmother's life, antique furniture, yellowed photographs, and shelves lined with dusty books. It felt like stepping back in time, a place frozen in the past. But as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Sarah began to feel uneasy. The house seemed to come alive at night, its walls groaning as if settling into a long-forgotten rhythm. She told herself it was just the wind, the old wood reacting to the temperature change. But deep down, she knew it was something more. The first sign came in the form of a faint tapping, like fingernails scratching against glass. It was soft at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire in the hearth, but as the night wore on, it grew louder, more insistent. Sarah searched the house, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but she found nothing. The tapping seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By the third night, the tapping had stopped, replaced by something far worse, a low, guttural humming. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls, a deep, resonant tone that made her teeth ache. She tried to ignore it, burying herself under blankets and pressing her hands over her ears. But the humming was relentless, worming its way into her mind until she could think of nothing else. And then she saw it. It was late, the moon casting an eerie glow through the windows. Sarah was sitting in the parlor, a book in her lap, when she felt a cold draft sweep through the room. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The mirror above the fireplace was fogged as if someone had breathed on it. But what made her blood run cold was the message scrawled across the glass. A single word, written in a shaky hand. Leave. Sarah stared at the word, her heart pounding. She told herself it was a prank, a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew better. The house was trying to tell her something, and she wasn't sure she wanted to listen. The next day, she decided to explore the town, hoping to find answers. The residents were reluctant to talk, their eyes darting nervously as she asked about the house. But one man, an elderly shopkeeper named Mr. Grayson, finally agreed to speak with her. That house has always been cursed, he said, his voice low and gravely. Your grandmother, she dabbled in things she shouldn't have. Things that should have been left alone. Sarah frowned. What kind of things? Mr. Grayson hesitated, his eyes narrowing. She was a collector of sorts. Not just books and trinkets, but other things. Dark things. Things that don't belong in this world. Sarah's stomach churned. She thought of the strange symbols etched into the floorboards, the jars filled with unidentifiable substances she'd found in the attic. She dismissed them as eccentricities, but now she wasn't so sure. That night, the house was quieter than usual, the air thick with tension. Sarah sat in the parlor, her eyes fixed on the mirror. The word had been wiped away, but she could still feel its presence, a lingering warning she couldn't ignore. And then the humming returned. It was louder this time, more intense, as if the house itself were alive. Sarah's head throbbed, her vision blurring as the sound grew deafening. She stumbled to her feet, clutching her ears, and ran to the door. But it was locked, the knob refusing to turn no matter how hard she twisted it. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, her breath visible in the cold air. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. And then she saw them. Shadows moving in the corners of the room, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. They were humanoid, but distorted. Their limbs too long, their faces featureless voids. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding as the shadows closed in. She could feel their presence, a cold, malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. And then one of them spoke, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You shouldn't have come here. Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the house. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding on the wooden floors as the shadows pursued her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get out. But the house seemed to shift around her, the hallways stretching and twisting like a maze. She finally reached the attic, the door slamming shut behind her. The room was filled with the same strange symbols she'd seen before, etched into the walls and floor. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface black and reflective. And standing in front of it was a figure, a woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. Sarah recognized her immediately. It was her grandmother. The woman turned, her lips curling into a grotesque smile. You should have listened, she said, her voice a chilling whisper. Now it's too late. Sarah's legs gave out and she fell to the floor, her mind unraveling as the shadows closed in. The last thing she saw was her grandmother's reflection in the mirror, her face twisted in a look of pure malice. When Sarah woke, she was back in the parlor, the fire crackling in the hearth. The house was silent, the shadows gone. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream. But then she saw it, the mirror above the fireplace, its surface fogged once again, and scrawled across the glass in the same shaky hand was a single word. Stay. Sarah knew then that she would never leave. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed her grandmother, and the shadows would always be waiting.